pleasure to see all of you this evening. We have some visiting with us. I understand Black Creek and Hueytown and Oak Mountain, maybe some other congregations are not meeting tonight. Possibility of all that, but I honestly, if we had to die by a tornado, I'd rather be in here studying the Bible and praising God and worshiping Him than, at home and hunkered down. And Greg, would you rather be that way? I would. For those of you visiting, we're glad you're here with us. We have been going through Bible readings on a schedule. It covers about three chapters a time. We want to do that real quickly. On our reading, we have come to 1 Samuel. And for Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and today, we go from 1 Samuel 1 through 1 Samuel 14. And I'd like for us to go through real briefly, catching us up to date. We have the conquering of, we go back. We have the creation. Let's see what we haven't done this in a long time. 17 periods. Creation, flood, then what happens? Scattering the people, then the patriarchs, then Exodus, wilderness wandering, invasion and conquest, then the Judges. And that's where we are right now. So the Judges takes us from the book of Judges all the way through Ruth, and then the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel. And then in 8, which is where we'll be here in a second, they say, give us a what? King. And so thus we find the beginning of the United Kingdom. All right, if you just look at 1 Samuel, 1 Samuel is divided into 3 major sections. We have the end of the Judges in the first 7 chapters. And those judges are Eli and Samuel. And then in chapter 8, they say, give us a king. And we have the anointing of Saul, 9 and 10. And really from that point through 15, chapter 15, we have the reign of Saul. Then in 16 through the end, it's the decline of Saul and the ascent of whom? David. And those are the main divisions that are in 1 Samuel. All right, who is born in chapter 1? Samuel. His mother is Hannah. Father is Elkanah. All right, Samuel is born in chapter 1. Chapter 2 is, you could divide it into a couple of halves. We have the Song of Hannah, her exaltation for the gift of Samuel. And then we see the need for Samuel because what was going on? Eli's sons are terrible. I mean, they're taking out the meat before it's even cooked for themselves. And then if you'll notice in verse 22, they even lay with women where? At the door of the tent of meeting, door of the tabernacle. So we see the need of it. Then in 3 and 4, we have the transition. In chapter 3, God does what? He calls Samuel. Samuel, Samuel, here am I. And then in chapter 4, the need of Samuel is seen because the Philistines defeat Israel and take what important object? The Ark of the Covenant. And this, when news gets back to Eli, we've been defeated, the Ark is gone. I'm looking down at verse 17 of chapter 4. The man brought tidings, answered and said, Israel has fled before the Philistines. There's a great slaughter among the people, and your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark is taken. When all that news comes to him, he falls backwards, and he was evidently a heavy-set guy, and what does he do? He breaks his neck, and he dies. So that's in chapter 5. In that's chapter 4. In chapter 5, the ark is in the hands of whom? The Philistines, and it passes around in Philistine territory, and everywhere it goes, what happens to the Philistines? Something bad, some curse about them. So in chapter 6, they decide it's better for us to return the ark, and they do, and yet there's some people in Israel who do what? And they're slain. The very thing, I think, They look inside. Yeah, you think about the Indiana Jones movie about that. And in I shouldn't have said that, should I? Chapter 7, what happens here? What happens to the Philistines? They get what? They get defeated. And then in chapter 8, when Samuel is old, verse 1, and he had made his sons judges. They knew the sons were terrible, and they just didn't like the way things were going, so they said, give us a king. If you're highlighting things and you're using a new Bible, verse 5 is a good one to highlight. Make us a king to judge after. And then in verse 6, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel, he takes it personally, doesn't he? He takes the case before God, and God says, they've not rejected you, but what? They've rejected me, that I should not be king over them. In fact, a little later, Samuel in chapter 12 says, God wanted to be your king, but you basically rejected him. And I think there's a powerful, powerful application there. Whenever we get dissatisfied with God's arrangement in the simplicity of Christianity, the simplicity of in this case, it was the organization, their government. Kirsten, you know where I'm going, don't you? They're dissatisfied with the government of the church. The government of Israel, just like people are with the government of the church when they reject the simplicity of it and multiply offices or make a pastor over a church. They're actually saying what? We're not what? We're not happy with the government you gave. We have this class, of course, and some others about church history, and we had basically elders and a presiding elder. Then he became known as the bishop over the elders. Then he was nominated as bishop and became a metropolitan in larger cities, and patriarch. Then you have 5 of them. Then by 606, you've got the Roman Catholic Church. And it's the idea that the simplicity of the New Testament arrangement, elders, deacons, and saints, was not good enough. And when you boil it all down. And that's the way it is. It's such a powerful lesson here. When anybody goes away from the arrangements, it doesn't matter if it's the worship of the church or how we're to encourage each other, and whatever God says, that's how things ought to be. And when people get dissatisfied, it's no different from their saying, give us a king. We want to be like the what? The nations round about us. All right, so then in chapter 9, Samuel meets Saul. And then in 10, Saul is anointed privately in the first 16 verses and has some miraculous signs. Then publicly in 17 through the end. In chapter 10, we have, that's chapter 10. Samuel finds Saul in chapter 9. I messed that up. Then in 10, Samuel anoints Saul. And then in chapter 11, Saul defeats the Ammonites, and it's just like, okay, this is exactly what we were looking for. Our king is going out and leading us in war and so on. In chapter 12, Samuel calls all Israel to Gilgal, and we have this speech. It looks like things are going well, but really not. They've rejected God and his mission, and we're going to see in 13, 14, and 15 that really Saul is not really a good choice. In 12, Samuel addresses them, and he vindicates God's will, God's way himself. And you'll notice look, a passage I've had highlighted for a long time. If you look down in verse 12, when ye saw that Nahash, the king of the children of Ammon, came against you, ye said unto me, nay, but a king shall reign over us, when Jehovah your God was your king. He already was your king, but you were rejecting him for someone else. Then in 13, 14, and 15, we have 3 major mistakes on the part of Saul. In chapter 13, the Philistines are still kind of mustering their troops ready to attack. And Samuel tells Saul, I don't want you to make a sacrifice until I get to you. And all of a sudden Saul, this was really a test of his faith, Saul saw these Philistines gathering, and so what does he go ahead and do, Patty? He offers a sacrifice, and by the time he starts, who arrives? Samuel. And so he says in verse 14, what's going to happen to Saul because of this mistake? Kingdom will not continue. Exactly. Then in chapter 14, we have Jonathan really comes into prominence, Saul's son, and they're again going up against the Philistines, others, and they're hungry. The men of Saul are hungry. And Saul makes this statement that nobody's to eat anything, and here you have honey just dropping everywhere. You have all kinds of food around. Nobody's to eat until, look at verse 24, until I be avenged of mine enemies. Well, in the process of time, who comes in and starts taking honey hither and yon and is refreshed? Jonathan does. And so Saul is going to have Jonathan what? Killed. And what do the people do on this occasion? What's that, Patty? They stand up for him, yes. And so Saul had this very, very unwise oath that he made them take. And that's where we'll stop. That gets us through chapter 14, which is where we were. I think 15 is probably the most best remembered because of the Amalekites and the what Saul did when God through Samuel said, "Don't do." Let's stop there. Yes, ma'am. Yes, yes. Yeah. Exactly. Saul's command was not based on a revelation from God. It just wasn't. And so you're exactly right. So the people could see through that. I mean, that's why are you telling us this when that's against common sense and reason? Okay. All right. Well, let's turn our attention briefly to Malachi, and we ended, for those of you visiting, we have been going through the Waldron material through the Bible, and we finished the Old Testament. Through the captivity and the captivity prophets, Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Lamentations, and then we had the return, and we studied Ezra, Nehemiah. We studied Haggai, Zechariah, and then Malachi. And we pointed out, I'm not going to show any slides right now on this, but Malachi evidently was written about the time Nehemiah 13, when Nehemiah had been recalled over to Babylon, and he comes back, and things have just fallen apart. 2 or 3 major ideas. They've not been bringing to God what? Their sacrifices and offerings. A second thing, they're tithing, A second thing, the marriages, what about that? Disregarded their marriages. And not really mentioned so much in Malachi, but it is in Nehemiah 13, a real problem. And we'll see, the Waldrons mentioned this, things changed during the time. They didn't keep the what day? The Sabbath day. Those 3 things were huge that were a part of the really, as the curtain begins to close on the Old Testament, those things were going on. The wives, they were getting rid of the wives of their youth for these pagan women. That created all kinds of problems. They weren't careful about their offerings, and even what they were bringing, a part of which was to go to the priest, was not going to the priest, so the priest had to go back out and work in the fields. And so then they weren't doing their jobs as well. All right, with all that in mind, we tell me David, some ideas on Malachi you want to share with us. You weren't with us when I made that assignment, were you? That's right, you weren't with us. Kirsten knows. Yeah, just any anything you found that was real helpful? In chapter 3? Good, good. Salvation of the righteous, even among what kind of people? Extremely wicked. Brother Jonathan read from Revelation 3. Did you remember? Did you? I just blew it. What was the word there, a phrase that was reminiscent of the end of chapter 3? The book of, was it looking 3 verse 16? 3:16? The book of remembrance, yeah, the book of remembrance. The book of life, we talked about that and how God has a record of everyone who is faithful to Him. Okay, what's another one, Brother Charlie? 2 or 3, or if you have. Yes. Yeah. Yes, a day is coming, and there will be a separation of the righteous from the wicked, and in a sense, that even happens during the time of now. Final separation, eternal separation. But you know, when you think about what the gospel does, you remember, everybody here can quote Romans 8:28. We know that to them that love God, all things work together for good, even to them that are called, even according to His purpose. The calling of God is through what message? The gospel. All right, so here in the very idea of the gospel is a separation. When we're called by the gospel, we're called out of what? Out of sin. And we're separated from that, put into His marvelous light, 1 Peter 2:9 and 10. So in a sense, there's a separation of the righteous from the wicked, even in the gospel. But the ultimate separation, final separation, will be in the judgment day. And all of these judgments are, of course, looking toward that time. Robin, what else did you have? Don't have anything? Lee? Weary in well-doing? Yes.
And you can become weary in serving the Lord at times because we're humans. But I think there is a challenge that all of us have to remind ourselves and to be joyful for and to be thankful for the things when we find ourselves in that category, really start looking at the things to be thankful for.
Exactly right. Yeah.
The idea is basically you have faith, the faith you're supposed to have in me, and God will, and I will answer.
Yeah. The windows of heaven would be open.
And while we're not under a physical kingdom now, the principle there of having faith that whatever the answers God gives you to your prayers is the right thing.
It will be in our best interest.
And it's just like,
yeah.
It's like if any of us can become anxious, it doesn't matter who you are. You may not stay anxious, but anybody could have a little anxious thought come through, and it's like you have to say no, you trust God. It's like, test me in this. You pray to Him, you turn everything over to Him, and you trust Him with it, just like these people should have trusted Him. See what He can do.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I was thinking about is I think it's such a great thread in the tapestry of the whole Bible story when we turn over to Luke chapter 1 and verse 16, and the very thing, the very words that that Malachi says are the very words that Gabriel quotes to Zechariah right there in that thread. After all that time, but there's been no word from the Lord, that thread is picked right back up.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, here we go.
Lee was mentioning this to me this afternoon, and as many times as I've taught the life of Christ, and mentioned Malachi 4 when we get to Luke 1, I've never just put it together like she just mentioned, and I think it's a really fine way that here the very last statement in the Old Testament is there's going to be Elijah the prophet, which we know is John the Baptist, and he's going to come, turn the hearts of the fathers to the children. In other words, he's going to try to get people to repent and be like some of the founding fathers, like Abraham was, in repentance and righteousness. And really, those are the very, if you looked at it from a linear point of view, after Malachi, then chronologically, the next thing that happens is Gabriel appears to Zechariah in Luke 1 and starts talking with him about the son that his wife Elizabeth is about to have. And that's there. And it's a beautiful tie when you think that's the last thing that is said. And really, when the angel announces to Zacharias about John, he uses that very thing. Isn't that neat? That in a chronological view of things, that happened next. And so it's just the picking up. Yeah, real good, sweetie. Anybody? Randy? Anything? Brother Gene?
God keeps his promises, whether it's meat punishment to those who deserve it, or those people who were in fear of his name and honored him, he held them up.
He remembered them.
And
Yeah.
the end result is they suffered their own neglect, and we see a nation of people that were, the eyes of the world were on them.
Yeah.
In the kingdom of David, and righteousness seemed to reign in their land, and they went from the glory of Solomon to licking the dirt
Of the Persians.
point in time.
Yes.
Living under control of a decrepit Seleucid Empire.
Yeah, and then, later on. That's right. Uh-huh.
Corrupted during the time we're fixing to study, and then
Yes.
by the time the Jews are in the first century and the Lord comes, they are a root keeping bunch of hypocrites.
Yes, that's exactly right. Hypocrisy gone to seed, really. Good, real good. Brother Richard?
I have to say that from the time that Israel became a nation, they came out of Egypt, that they showed that that is the sad time where what they were supposed to do they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Amidst all the threatenings and curses and what's going on to them, they didn't remain faithful. God gave us 500 years from the time of Malachi to Jerusalem fell
Mm-hmm.
under the sentence.
They never did. That's a good point. 500 years from the time of Malachi to AD 70, basically. And they still did. And it's interesting, even during the Lord's ministry, we pointed this out on the chart Sunday, that Jesus spoke of the fact that, in some of the parables, the wicked husbandman, the marriage feast in Matthew 22, and they got his point. And then the destruction of Jerusalem, Matthew 24, it's like he was telling them all this. And that beautiful, it's not beautiful, but it's sad in Matthew 23, where he ends, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that killest the prophets and stonest those that would send unto thee. How oft would I have gathered thy chicks under thy wings, my wings, but you would not. Henceforth, your house is left unto you desolate." Desolate. God was removing his presence from it. And then Blessed are, he ends by saying, you'll not see me till people will say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. That people would recognize that he's the Messiah and obey his gospel. And so he's really catapulted into the age of the gospel. But so many times there is, I was thinking, I've got it on a note I want to share with you in a minute. Paul concludes Romans 10 with a quotation from Isaiah 65. All the day long, you can quote it, can't you, sweetie? All the day long I spread forth my hands unto a gainsaying and rebellious people, but you would not. And it's like exactly what Richard said. It's just over and over and over. And it's not God's fault that they were. And, when we try our best to encourage people to do what's right, to obey the gospel, whether it be children, grandchildren, neighbors, and we show them what it's all about. And they basically say the same thing the Jews said, thanks but no thanks. Don't blame yourself. I have done a lot of that. I thought, maybe I just didn't say it just right. Well, Jesus said everything just right. And remember in John 6, when he said, except you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. Upon this, many of the disciples walked no more with him. And then he looked to the 12 and said, would you also go away? And to his credit, Peter said, Lord, to whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life. To his credit. But a lot of people just, if Jesus said some things they didn't like, they went away. And so, we do the best we can, then leave it in God's hands. Another point, I'm just kind of thinking out loud with you. Isaiah 55, my word shall not return unto me void, but it will prosper in that to which I send it. And so, when we try our best and love for our neighbors, do what we can, then let I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. 1 Corinthians 4. Okay. Yes.
They had the vineyard and the stewards killed the people.
Yes.
Chased them off, and he killed, that's an example of killing the prophets.
Prophets, and then the apostles, or the son. They'll reverence my son. Yeah.
And then they pronounced that the person he would come and kill these wicked.
Yes. We kind of went hurriedly. That's a great story there in Matthew 21. And in that, he kind of flips the trap door. He says, what ought to be done to these people? These miserable men ought to be miserably killed. And he said, did you not read the stone which the builders rejected, the same was made the head of the corner? And this is marvelous in there. Then they understood he was speaking of, and made them mad. Yeah. Yes, sir, David. Yes. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Reminding of, was it Luke 14, the end of the chapter where he says, if a person puts his hand to the plow and looks back, he is not fit for the kingdom. He's not fit. Yes, sir.
You said this about the time of Nehemiah 13.
Right.
Nehemiah 10, they just signed the document.
Yeah.
We're going to do whatever God says.
Exactly.
We're going to get we make a covenant back with him.
Yeah.
Didn't last long.
No. Yeah, those last chapters of Nehemiah are so revealing. They have there's a grand revival, then prayer and confession, and then covenant, sign their names to it. Yes. Yeah, and I think I'm guilty of this, maybe trying to oversimplify when we say they. We mean the majority of them, but not everybody. And I'm glad you said that, because there's always been a remnant, though a few, but you're right. And I think that's what he's talking about here in 3:16, Malachi 3:16. Then they that feared the Lord spoke one with another, and he heard, and a book of remembrance was written, and they'll be mine, verse 17, my own possession. and I'll spare them, and you'll return and discern between the righteous. And then the separation is mentioned in verse 1 of chapter 4. But then he comes back in verse 2. But unto you who fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness rise with healing in his wings. You'll go forth and frolic or gamble as calves out of the stall, tread down the wicked. So you're right, Patty. I think those verses show there is still that remnant there. Yes, yeah, it's negative, yeah. Yes, and that's a great, and I'm glad you point that out, because that is, we're looking at Israel as a physical nation, and we're looking basically at the majority, what the majority is thinking, the majority is doing. But you still have the righteous few, the remnant, and that would be, you think when you come to the New Testament, Luke chapter 2, there were two, a man and a woman, you remember? Simeon, who was looking for the consolation of Israel, and Anna, or I may have this reversed, Anna was looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. I may have the redemption of Jerusalem, consolation of Israel, reversed on the two. But those were the two who were looking for it, and they were, obviously what's said about Anna is just outstanding. You know, she stayed around the temple, and she was praying, and there are just a number of things about her, as well as Simeon. So you've got two that are just in that one chapter. There were others. You'd even almost say that the wise men in Matthew 2 were among people who, even Gentiles, who had somehow they had an inkling about what God was doing, and had some revelation made known to them that they were coming. So you're right. Exactly. Oh, that's a great lesson, that we can do right, guys, even in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Paul said in Philippians 2 that we are to shine as lights in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. And we can. Who comes to mind during the darkest days of the judges that stands out as a bright light? To tell you that was to give you the answer. Who, Lynn? Did you say something? It's during the days of the judges. If I tell you it's outside the book of Judges, it gives it away. Ruth, yeah. Ruth, Boaz. Think about Naomi. What kind of a lady was she? And these are cases of pockets of righteous people. And we're to, Jesus makes the point. We are the salt of the earth, the light of the world. And we're to continue to do the best we can. And there'll always be people, this, guys. You can take this to the bank. In Daniel 2:44, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven shall set up a kingdom that shall never be, what? Destroyed. Nor shall the sovereignty thereof be left to another people. It shall stand forever. What's the kingdom there referring to? The church. People like you and me, who are trying to do what's right. Though we make mistakes, we're going to make them right, then go on from there. And that just means that there will always be people on earth who want to do right. During Elijah's day, Lord, they've killed your prophets, they've torn down your altars, only I'm left. What did he say? There's 7,000 who've not bowed the knee to Baal. All right, good point. Sister Eleanor, we've overlooked you. Did we say it all? Yes. Exactly. You think about the millennials and then people younger in the 20s. I think we got one in the class right now who's trying to do right among names. But you think about people who are, you have a classification of people. It just seems like you can't find hardly any who want to do right. There are some there. And we just have to keep at it, never give up. Preach the word, be instant or urgent, in season. That's evidently when people like it, and out of season. both times. Okay, anybody else?
Think of our own weakness
Yeah,
and think, maybe we might think, we're better off, we're better than those people.
yes, but given the circumstances.
Condemnation in the book of Hebrews says you're worthy of sore punishment if you
Trodden underfoot. Yes,
commandments
yes,
the blood of Christ.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, we have a superior covenant.
God's patient beyond patience,
Yeah,
and we just need to bank on that.
yeah, exactly right. I made the point was we're studying Hebrews out at the prison that there in 2, we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things that were. If God spoke through angels and Moses in the Old Testament, now He's spoken through Christ, and the word of angels proves steadfast. How much more should we give heed to the words of Christ? And you think about all of the. Yeah, I know y'all think probably like I do, at least on some things. You think about people who, in your past, maybe grandparents, great-grandparents, and the things that they went without, and how they overcame so many physical obstacles to make something out of themselves, to be right, and to try to be faithful to their spouses. And in spite of a lot of dire circumstances. And then here we are, air conditioning houses and cars and nice roads and so many things they didn't have, that we ought to look at ourselves as we're responsible for more because we have more advantages, more opportunities than some did. I think that. Don't y'all think the same thing when you look back at it? I do. I think sometimes about my dad. I don't think I hold a candle to my dad and what he had to come through when he was young, and the difficulties he had family-wise to try to do right, and we really don't have to look far before we see somebody who really, really struggled to make it. Lee's mom today is the 2nd year of her death. She died March 30, 2 years ago, and we were talking about that earlier. And Ms. Ratliff had tremendous odds to overcome, and she did. Became a faithful Christian, did the best she could. And I just look at that and look at what you were saying too, Patty and Sister Eleanor, that we've got advantages. We want to use them and bank on God's grace, and don't get too high and mighty and think, if I'd been back there, I'd never done what they did. We don't know what we've done, given the circumstances like Brother Gene was talking about. I hope we would have been faithful. And the only way we could prove it is what? When times are difficult now, that we're faithful. Yeah. Okay. I thought I wouldn't get very far. For those of you visiting, our next part after this of the Old Testament will be the years of silence in pages 115 and following. I wanted to tell you a couple things and then try to review a few things that Richie Thetford, who has gone through the Waldron material, has developed some slides that I thought we would do. Some of you can't see what this is, can you? Greg, you have some books you've duct taped together? Duct tape covers a multitude of sins, doesn't it? This is Halley's Bible Handbook. A lot of you have it. I really enjoy trying to give it away as a gift for graduates. But he mentions some things. He is so succinct, and I just really enjoy reading. But he's got a great section on the years of silence, if you'd like to read. It's really boiled down more so than the Waldron material. But just 2 or 3 sentences. The Old Testament is account of a nation. The New Testament is account of a man. The nation was founded and nurtured of God to bring the man into the world. What do you think about that? I don't think you get it more succinct than that. God himself became a man to give mankind a concrete, definite, tangible idea of what kind of person to think of when we think of God. God is like Jesus. Jesus was God incarnate in human form. He goes on to say the whole Bible is builded around this beautiful story of Christ and his promise of life eternal to those who accept him. The Bible was written only that men might believe and understand and know and love and follow Christ. Christ, the center and heart of the Bible, the center and heart of history, is the center and heart of our lives. Our eternal destiny is in his hands. Our acceptance or rejection of him determines for each of us eternal glory or eternal ruin, heaven or hell, one or the other. And he goes on there. That's just in one little section here. And then he's got a good, nice little section on the Bible. And then he's got a great section on the time in between the Testaments. All of you have Halley's, not Haley. I've heard brethren confused, not Homer Haley. This is Halley, Halley, Halley's Bible Handbook. Still in print, and I highly recommend it. He was a Christian church preacher around the turn of the century, 1900s, and did a lot of good, I think, in a lot of ways. Okay, here were some overall lessons I thought about from the Old Testament that we've spent a few years studying. This orderliness is a witness to his eternal nature. The days of creation, you have 1, 2, 3, light, firmament, and then land, and then 4, 5, and 6, light. What's next? Fish and fowl. Then 6. Yes, animals and man. Vague promises of the Messiah. The 3:15. We have in 12 the Abrahamic promises. They increase in detail as time continued. Types and shadows of the priesthood, the tabernacle. As time progressed in the Old Testament, more details are given. Well, you know, if somebody was just writing this at one time, there's not enough time. You can't live long enough. And so I think all of that testifies to God's eternal nature. That's just one thing. God's providence is seen throughout. You remember the selling of his being sold by his brothers. And then the real moving chapter 45 of Genesis, when he reveals himself to his brethren and they're just startled beyond belief. And he says, don't be alarmed. It was not you who did it, but God. Well, God used their hatred, the favoritism of Jacob and so on. Moses' young life, you remember, all the baby boys are to be killed, and so his mother and father put him in a little ark of what? What was it? Bulrushes. Put it in the very river surrounded by crocodiles and other things. And who was watching over him? His sister, Miriam. And then it just so happened that Pharaoh's daughter was bathing. So, let's take him. Oh, wait, out pops Miriam. If you need a nurse, I know just the person. And so he was schooled in the ways of the Egyptian. All that working providential is just a beautiful, beautiful story. How God used Israel's refusal to drive out nations in Canaan. We saw that in Judges 3, to chastise them later. The stories of Ruth, the story in Esther. All of that's shown God's providence. The rules and the affairs of men. His love and long suffering is prominent. Noah's generation. How long did Noah preach while the ark was preparing to try to get those people to repent? 120 years, yeah. The patriarchs. Moses' reluctance to lead Israel. You remember that? Chapters 3 or 4 of Exodus. Israel's sins in the wilderness. All the time through the judges, the kings, the prophets, and that's the passage we quoted a while ago. God is just. His punishments can be seen as just when, like in Leviticus 10, everybody in this room remembers that. The sons of Aaron offer strange fire. Who were they? Nadab and Abihu. Here is people say, well, I don't understand why God did that because a lot of people sinned. This was the very first day of the sacrifices that were being offered by the priest. The very first day. Not the second or third, the first day. And they did it with a high hand. They offered unauthorized fire. Numbers 20. What did Moses do there that kept him out of the promised land? He smote the rock when he should have spoken to it. And God said, because you refused to sanctify me in the eyes of the people. You did not set me apart as special. And then in 2 Chronicles 26, king in Judah who was full of pride and wanted to offer incense in the temple, Uzziah, what was he stricken with immediately? Leprosy. And so God he's long-suffering in love, but he's also just in his punishments. No other reasonable explanation for the Old Testament text than God's divine hand guiding inspired writers. You think about all the foundational stuff that's mentioned in the first 3 chapters relative to who God is, the creative powers, man's responsibility, what happens when man sins, the roles of marriage, sin and its consequences that recur. And then you just think about only pertinent events that further the narrative and that show connections to what preceded and what follows. 6 through 8, what do we have in Genesis 6 through 8? The what? The flood. And then the flood is used even in Matthew 24, as were the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. You have the judgment of God, the Abrahamic promises. 14, Melchizedek is introduced, and we have a lot in Hebrews about him. Covenant of circumcision in 17. That's used, that idea of circumcision. Even circumcise your hearts, mentioned in Jeremiah. And 19, the destruction of what 2 cities? Sodom and Gomorrah, really more than that. It's always right to obey, always wrong to disobey. We've talked about this in some of your comments. That's just that's all through. And then everything is foundational for the coming of Christ, the entrance of his spiritual kingdom, whereas God primarily dealt with one nation. It was for the purpose of bringing Jesus into the world, who would provide salvation for people from all nations. And we learn the need of a Savior because we see the problems, the consequences, the guilt sin brings. We see the need of a priesthood, someone, an intercessor, the need to worship. Worship helps us to be more like the one we adore. And the blessings of obedience, the curses of disobedience should be the same for us in the New Testament. Those were just some that came to mind as just kind of an overall, somebody asked you, what are some principles you learned from the Old Testament? I think those are some. Any comment or question? Anybody? I know our time is shot. Feel free. Charlie, you look like you wanted to say something.